Welcome back. You should have just watched a clip from Victory in the Pacific, and hope you enjoyed that. And let's talk about the Pacific a little bit more,
Sure.
Dr. McFall, and what Goodbye Darkness, how that illuminates the experience of the soldier in the Pacific theater.
So one of the questions we want to talk about this is whether he in fact sees himself as illuminating the experience of a generic soldier. But putting that aside for the moment, uh, what you have in this book is essentially a travel narrative, taking you through the important battlefields, at least the important land battlefields in World War II.
And that's a modern travel narrative.
Yes.
He's going back and
Or a
revisiting,
contemporary at the time he wrote it.
which was
So it was published in 79, so
Okay.
it's probably 75, 76.
So in the
77.
mid-70s, he's going back to each of these islands,
Exactly.
and he's merging the modern travel narrative experience with his historical memories, which may or may not be accurate, but which are probably true.
Yes. And the date is important because it's early enough that the people he meets along the way remember his experiences. Not necessarily his experience, but they remember the war, right? And so he goes to New Guinea, and he goes to Guadalcanal, and he goes to Tarawa, and he goes to the Marianas, and he goes to Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, right? And notice these are all islands. New Guinea, a particularly big one. And the experience he captures there is a particular kind of experience. It's the experience of the infantry soldier, especially the Marines. He has some unkind words for the Army here and there. He doesn't capture the experience of bomber pilots or submariners and so on. And he doesn't pretend he does. This is his travel narrative, not a generic travel narrative that's meant to capture everybody.
Okay. And to just kind of clarify the history, this progression of islands was how we fought the war.
That's
right?
correct. That's
We
largely correct.
sort of started in Hawaii
Yes.
and marched our way to Japan just every so
And this is
often taking
dictated
an
by
island.
geography, right?
Okay.
And the important part of geography is not what it used to be. If this had been 50 years ago, it would have been coaling stations.
Okay.
In 1940s, it's airstrips, right? So you have to capture islands within a reason, or maybe I should say, all of the strategic choices that are made in terms of what island you capture are directed toward where you can use the airstrips to dominate that region.
And each of these islands is it a fuel issue? There's only so much fuel that you can go from island to island and you have to refuel?
It is partly that. It is partly just simply the territory there and whether you can build a good airstrip. It's partly what emerges as a strategy of island hopping where you don't capture everything, because the idea is that if you can cut off the Japanese lines of communication and supply, you can simply leave the soldiers there to starve or to rot or whatever happens. So really it's about dictating command of the sea by using air power, right? And so you capture these islands in order to use air power.
And is it pretty clear to everybody what the next island is going to be?
Yes, more or less.
More or less.
There are occasional arguments.
Okay.
No, there are no or few surprise attacks, and there are only a few arguments. And the one specific one he talks about here is Peleliu, where he quite clearly says this is a battle that should never have been fought.
Now why is that?
Because as the American Navy gets stronger and as the capabilities of the American air power get clearer, it turns out that they can move right from the Marshalls to the Philippines, and they don't really need to attack Peleliu at all. Originally, it was seen as both a air base and as a Japanese strong point, and it turns out they don't care how many Japanese are there, but they invade anyway.
Now, can you say a little bit about the style of attack, the amphibious landing? Because this is a fairly new thing, isn't it?
Yes, and in fact, I think it's reasonable to suggest it's a kind of tactical approach, which is invented by the Marine Corps in the 30s as a way of justifying the Marine Corps' existence, and is perfected in the Second World War, and it involves targeting a specific beach or set of beaches on an island and coordinating naval bombardment from cruisers and battleships, along with air attacks from carriers, in order to suppress the opposition on the beach so that Marines usually, but sometimes Army, can use specially designed landing craft, sometimes landing craft infantry, the LCI, sometimes craft big enough that it can carry tanks, the LCT, designed to swim and crawl and float all together, right? So they sail up to the reef, because many of these islands are surrounded by barrier reefs. Then they're designed to have tracks so that they can crawl over the reef and land on the beach. And so you can land a tank directly on the beach.
Okay.
That's the theory.
And we also did this in Normandy?
We did this in Normandy. Many of the one reason why Normandy works is that they were able to apply the lessons they learned in the Pacific.
Okay.
For making something like this effective.
And this is a pretty high casualty way to do things, right?
It is well, there's an interesting split.
Okay.
And it's clear in this book, and he talks about it beginning in Peleliu. For the first half of the war, there are extremely high casualties getting on the beach. In the end, you've got all of this high technology, but there's only, a little bit of water separating you and the machine gun as you wade in. And lots of casualties in the first day or two. The battle in many of these islands is over in a week. And they're very high casualty but short lasting operations. What the tactical turns that the Japanese make is to decide that they're not going to win these battles. And the only purpose for defending these islands is in fact to cause casualties. And so that happens in Peleliu, it happens in Iwo Jima, it happens in Okinawa. And each of these places they don't defend the beach, at least not significantly. And instead they spend an enormous amount of time and resources digging in on the island itself and forcing the Americans to come dig them out. And that's when the battles become much longer. That's when the beach landing becomes easy, but the casualty rate after they get on the beach just explodes.
Okay.
And that's his experience, remember, because he doesn't do any fighting until Okinawa.
And let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Because that sort of hits you at the end when you read the ending portion that, well, actually, the only place I was Guadalcanal, and everything else I'm just interpolating my story into history.
Yeah.
That sort of radically refocuses how we read this, and he doesn't tell us this till the end. And I thought that was really sneaky.
Yeah, I remember actually you being kind of mad about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that we're reading. We don't find out until the end that we're reading his. And what was he there for? Like a month?
He's there for a little, I think, 2 months.
2
but
months.
No more than that. Yeah.
So we have 2 months on Okinawa.
On Okinawa, and that's it. He's been in other islands, but after they've been occupied.
And he takes the experiences through there and spreads them out over 4 years, as if he was at every one of these beaches. And nobody could have been on every one of these assaults.
That's right.
Could they have?
No, and in fact, the pattern of action is that your unit will be committed. It will fight for a couple weeks or a month. It will take huge casualties, and then it won't fight again for 7 or 8 months.
And where do they go in the meantime?
Australia, New Guinea. There's that great scene here, right, which we may come back to, the Battle of Brisbane, where these American soldiers are kind of going back, landing in Australia as the Australian soldiers are leaving for somewhere, and they're taunting the Australians that while the Australians are gone, they're going to have sex with all of the Australian women, single or married or elsewise. Mm-hmm. And they ended up getting in a battle with their own allies. Well, they also went back after these battles to Australia or Hawaii and lived amongst civilians. In fact, there's actually... I know it's true in Australia. I don't know about in Hawaii, but in Australia there's a governmental office whose job it is to link up. Got to be careful with words in the 21st century. To link up soldiers on leave or back from the island campaigns with Australian women who will be willing to accompany them
for social events and movies.
For social events and movies, and that's the objective.
Yeah. Well, that's very nice of them.
After the war, the Japanese government sets up an organization. The Japanese government is terrified that American GIs. Remember, GI is specifically a specific label that refers to the Army soldiers, but it gets in slang and here used just generally to refer to American servicemen. Mm-hmm. They're afraid that American servicemen are going to come to Japan and rape every Japanese woman they see. So they set up an organization to recruit Japanese women to sleep with American soldiers so that the rest of the women will be safe. And in fact, the rate of rapes is vanishingly small while this organization exists, and then goes way up as soon as the Japanese government phases it out. And I have to imagine there's something like that in this Australian initiative, although it was never said publicly.
Because this was the 40s.
Yes, exactly.
And
These were allies.
These were allies. Okay,
But
so
it is an interest. So to come back to the broader point you made, though, it's not even in the main narrative, right?
It's in the
He keeps this in the
afterwards, yeah.
afterwards, in the thanks. And if you don't read that kind of stuff, which many readers don't, you'll never know.
and this takes us very close to a novel.
Mhm.
I mean, because he's imagining experiences, or at least he's transplanting experiences into each of these places. So this, we talked last time about that there's not a big bright line between novels and memoirs, and this really blurs that line, because it really, once you realize that until we get to Okinawa, none of these things actually happens where he sets them. We're dealing with something really very fictional.
And I'm not sure why. I've got guesses as to why he does that. Of course, he's dead now. I'd love to ask him. But, I mean, one of my guesses is that he just didn't think he could hold readers' attention with a standard history for the first 300 pages until he gets to the point where he actually does fighting.
Yeah.
But another one of the guesses is that this isn't really meant to be a narrative account. It's meant to be a thematic account, or to tell to have a narrative arc that isn't really parallel to the events of the war. And so he inserts these stories when they make a narrative point rather than when they make a chronological point.
So let's sort of assume we're dealing with something very like a novel here. What's the novel about? What's the story?
I think it's a love story.
A love story.
Yeah. And
Okay.
it's a love story with two, I don't know what the right word is, partners or
Beloveds.
love objects, beloveds.
Love objects. Love
One of
things.
them is an institution,
Mhm.
and that's the Marine Corps.
Mhm.
Right. And he falls in love with the Marine Corps. I mean, he's kind of flirting with the Marine Corps. His dad sets him up, right, with almost a blind date with the Marine Corps. And he falls in love in boot camp. And by the end of the war, he falls out of love. Right? And this is very specific. He says on page 382, right, this is in the middle of his experiences, and, well, you have to assume it's sometime in Okinawa. Right. Actually, it starts on 381. My feelings about Sugarloaf were mixed. Remember, Sugarloaf is this hill that they were trying to take in Okinawa for quite a while. As I look back, it was somewhere on the slopes of that hill where I confronted the dark underside of battle that passion died between me and the Marine Corps. The silver cord had been loosed, the golden bowl broken, the pitcher broken at the fountain, the wheel broken at the cistern. Half the evil in the world is done in the name of honor.
And this is right after the unit killed a bunch of women.
Yes,
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so one of the objects of this affection is the Marine Corps, and the things that he did while in the Marine Corps, and the way the Marine Corps kind of presented or perceived that kind of behavior leads him to fall out of love.
So that's the cruel and sordid
Yes,
things that we referenced in the
Yeah.
beginning with Winston Churchill.
I think the other logic or the other object of his affection is the United States. Right. And we talked about this earlier, and he says this again and again, that the society he was fighting for did not. I mean, the society betrayed him. Right.
Now, he's writing this in 1979, or he's publishing it in
Yes. So
1979.
somewhere in the mid to late 70s.
Do you think he would say that now?
I think there are ways in which he would be happier now than he was. Right.
Because he's writing this right after the Vietnam
Yeah.
War,
That's right.
where American respect for the military is at an all-time low. The soldiers are getting spat on, and that's not the case now.
No.
I mean, we've sort of seen a resurgence there.
We've seen a resurgence most broadly in the role or the perception of the soldiers as most obvious, right, in this kind of cliche that right or wrongly, but a cliche that we're supposed to support the troops regardless of whether we approve of the war or not. It's also true more specifically in the sense that his generation has become revered, right? Through TV shows like Band of Brothers, through movies like Saving Private Ryan, through any number of...
Peter Jennings wrote The Greatest Generation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right? The generation that...
And that's even their name now. They're the greatest.
Yeah, it was... So my grandparents...
Right. We're millennials or boomers. Yeah. They're the greatest. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's a generation that experienced and emerged from the Great Depression without some kind of corruption or corrosion. They then went off and fought a good war against bad people and triumphed. And then they came home and they built the economic and cultural successes of the 50s.
Right.
And we just say the words greatest generation and we know exactly what you're talking about. That's probably not true in the 70s. And that comes through most specifically in his reference when he goes to Peleliu and he sees this memorial that's built for soldiers who died there. And it's a memorial that has been allowed to crumble, right? There are letters missing from the plaque on the memorial. And he kind of pauses bitterly to say, why did we fight this if people were just going to forget about it? And the greatest generation likes the 50s. Many of them hate the 60s. Right. And many of them hate the 70s. And although we tend in our memory to minimize the 70s are just a continuation of the cultural ferment of the 60s, except now you've lost the Vietnam War. You're not just fighting about the Vietnam War.
But it doesn't seem like that to me because, I was a kid in the 70s.
Yeah,
I didn't remember the 60s.
I did not either.
So growing up, the 70s were when life began for me.
Yes. Yes. And if you go to the end of the 70s, so when I was 11 or 12, that's when the United States, or the Soviet Union has just invaded Afghanistan.
Right.
And so you take, so on TV last night, Sylvester Stallone's pair of movies, which I'm blanking on now, but it's the Rambo movies.
First Blood.
Yes.
Yeah.
The first of those is distinctly a movie of the 60s and 70s, one where a Vietnam vet has come back and been mistreated by the American population. The second one turns an angry, bitter veteran who's upset at the American population, turns him into a patriotic hero.
Right.
And that's the change. And this book is written before that pivot point.
That's the from Carter to Reagan.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's interesting because this is a book about World War II written with a Vietnam sensibility. Yeah. So is Slaughterhouse-Five, the next book we're going to read. And as you'll see, Slaughterhouse-Five is an intentionally broken narrative. And with no apologies. This is a broken narrative where the author says the things that I experienced in World War II, but also that he's experiencing in Vietnam, in the Vietnam War, make it impossible to create a coherent narrative. And we get a sense of that in this book too, don't we? Maybe not to the extent we'll see in Vonnegut, but there's a coherence issue in this narrative, and he is very upfront about this, right? He says, let's look at that. He talks a lot about the fact that individual soldiers cannot see very much of the battlefield, that they have their own particular perspective, and you can't craft a broad narrative out of a whole set of individual stories. But where he really says this is in the chapter about about Okinawa, in 365, where he says, after a line break, right, so he's getting your attention in the prose, now I enter a time in which a structured account of events is impossible. Continuity disappears, the timepiece in the attic of memory ticks erratically. Right? I'm skipping a sentence, certain incidents and impressions can be recalled, but only as a kaleidoscopic montage. Somewhere in here occurred the truce of the fucking dogs. One of our war dogs got loose, ran out of the killing field ground north of Sugarloaf, somehow met, and so on and so on. Right? He tells his stories, but he can't connect them. Yeah.
And he can't find meaning in them.
Now let's settle on this for a minute, because this is a course broadly where we want to talk about memories of combat. And narrative in the traditional sense, is a very artificial thing
Yeah.
when we're dealing with memories, because it structures everything into a neat sequence of causes and effects. But life doesn't happen that way. So what is Manchester, or how is Manchester remembering combat?
I would say he's remembering it so he's having visions in a sense, right? He's remembering it episodically in ways that are disconnected from time and space.
Okay.
Which is probably not a bad phrase to remember when you're going
When you're
to
going into Slaughterhouse 5, because
he's remembering it. So one way you can make a narrative is to establish meaning, right? And craft an arc in which all of these experiences, even if you can't connect them individually, fall into a broader sense of meaning. But he's just said the war that he thought he was fighting and the meaning he thought he was getting out of it didn't happen.
So what we get is a structured narrative that is coherent, that proceeds from place to place, from time to time, in an orderly,
The
sequential
travel
way.
narrative is sequential and orderly.
And then at the end, he tells you, this is all a lie,
Yep.
basically. This
Yep.
this sequencing that I did was all
Mhm.
artificial.
Mhm.
That was all part of a narrative that I constructed later.
Yeah.
So where does that leave the original experiences? Just flashpoints of disembodied memories?
So I would argue, and you probably can explain this better than I can, human beings are storytelling creatures, right? We want narratives.
And we're meaning-making creatures. We use narrative to create meaning out of our experiences.
I think actually he is it's an odd kind of thing, this story, because I think he is one of the more honest authors about war that we find in confessing that the narrative he's created is false.
Right.
And if you listen, so it is cliched again that World War II veterans never talk about their experiences, and that is sometimes true, right? My grandpa told many stories about the experiences he had in the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, before the war started and after it was done. But there is this big, broad gap in the middle.
Right.
Leaving me in Vienna when I took students to Europe, leaving me in Vienna and Prague and Dresden, pretty sure that my grandpa actually bombed these places, but not being positive because he would never tell me.
And he was a bomber?
He was a co-pilot in a B-17.
Okay.
And so I remember getting a tour from the president of the Army Historical Museum in Vienna, where they were running an exhibit on Vienna in 1944, and a lot of it was devoted to the bombing raids. And I said not to tell him. It's probably my grandpa who did that.
My grandpa was running a furniture store in Long Beach at the time.
Yeah.
And he would always tell us stories about how the blackouts, how they had landscapes they put on their roofs so that people would think about it. But he was on the home front. He was a little too old for the war.
So it is a point worth making, and I think one that Manchester really demonstrates, that politically speaking, the war ends in 1945. Right? Politically and militarily, the war ends in 1945. But from a personal experience perspective, the war is not ever done. Right? The war is not, and we will see this again when we get to the collection of short stories called The Things We Carried. Right?
And we saw, this is the epigraph of All Quiet on the Western Front, where he says the men who survived the war but were destroyed by it. But you have one interesting thing, because one of the things this book is history.
Yeah.
Is sort of a very historical approach to fitting together the war. But the way that what he reveals at the end kind of blows up the history too.
Mm-hmm.
What does it say? What's the difference between a memory of combat and a history of combat?
Well, that's a good question. One answer might be, although I don't think it applies for everybody, that a memory of combat is a memory of a personal experience, and a history of combat is the summary of a whole variety of personal experiences somehow added and melded together. I don't know that that's really, I don't know. That doesn't ring true to me. That's one answer, and I suppose it's a good answer.
And you're a historian.
I am.
I am not a historian.
I am, however, very aware that we need to be careful about the kind of claims we can make for historical actors, right? Because we are taking people's memories. Sometimes they are memories as told to us by people who experience them. Sometimes they are, I guess, artificial memories as recorded on pieces of paper or on tapes, like the tapes of the White House conversations for Nixon or whatever. But we're taking memories and we're trying to weave them into a coherent narrative that gives them structure and gives them meaning in the same way that he's doing.
And we normally try to make the narratives fit with what we are perceiving now. I mean, this is
That
how
often happens.
this
yes.
is how the past conspired to get together to produce us.
Yes. Historians will often argue that that's a bad way to do history, but I think they often do it anyway, and I don't know how you not do it, right? That's the people we are.
But I know I read a lot of the popular history. I have recently read a lot of history of the American Revolutionary era, and all of the big themes that people are talking about. It occurs to me that none of the people going through this knew those themes.
Yeah, that's right.
And none of the people going through this combat understood the war the way that we understand it. And how does what we know now affect our memories?
It always affects us, right? And I don't think, frankly, it's possible to disentangle them for human beings, right? The memories, there's lots of psychological research about the way in which memories are formed and the way in which memories are shaped. And one thing that's very clear is that telling the story reshapes the story in your mind.
Right.
And so in the act of telling things, you are remembering things in a specific way, which will lead you to continue to remember them that way. There's lots of research that suggests that the context in which you form a memory shapes the way you remember it. And the lesson here is that one lesson is that historians have to be very modest about what they can really know. In the same way that ordinary individuals have to be very modest. And he says this, right? He doesn't quite know what's true here. And he says, yes, I had a head injury. I was wounded. I don't really know what I remember that's true and what's false. And I think historians need to recognize that the lack of a head trauma doesn't mean that we have some kind of automatic access to the memories of the past.
But history tremendously privileges eyewitness accounts.
Yes.
Is that reliable?
No, it's not.
Okay.
It's no. So with the parenthetical statement that it's frequently true that none of it is absolutely reliable. Now that doesn't mean, I want to be clear here, because that does not mean I think that our entire memory of the whole existence of the world is false.
So there was Japan.
Japan presumably existed in the past.
And there'd been World War II happened.
Yes.
We're pretty sure of that.
I am, although
Right.
I would actually argue that World War II is two regional wars that shared a couple of combatants.
That's true.
So one of the things to remember here is that one thing historians do is interpret events, as I say, and create a meaning. And so this idea that World War II was a war that encompassed the whole world with one narrative, that's a mistake, I think.
But that's an American perspective.
That is an American
because
perspective.
we were in both theaters.
Yes, exactly.
Was anybody else really in both
Only
theaters?
I suppose a little bit the Australians, but really Britain and the United States are the only ones who really fight extensively in both theaters.
So saying that this is World War II is itself interpreted.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
And it also interprets the First World War as the first of something.
Yeah, and in fact, of course, it wasn't called the First World War in
Right.
the 20s because there was no Second World War yet.
Right.
And there's plenty of arguments about whether World War I was a world war or not.
Okay.
What I would say, so one thing I would say is that, to kind of come back to your question, all history is about memories.
Okay.
And all history draws on individual memories. Historians are often trying to craft a narrative which goes beyond the individual perspective to encompass a wide variety of perspectives. Memoirists, I think, are primarily interested in their single narrative memory, even though they are trying to put that memory in a broader context.
And and I'll say from my disciplinary
Yeah.
perspective, because this is how we're supposed to do this in human studies, all narrative is artificial
Yeah. Mhm.
because we don't live or originally experience the world as a sequence of causes and effects. But we're almost incapable of understanding the world without placing things into a sequence of
Yeah.
causes and effects. So we build narratives out of memories, which are really much more like dreams. Every once in a while I have a dream, and then I'll wake up and I'll turn it into a story, and I'll think this would make a good novel.
Mhm.
But that's the narrative I'm putting on what is really just a fairly chaotic and random collection of images. Well, that's what life is a fairly random and chaotic collection of experiences that in order to make any sense out of it all, even at the very basic level, we have to structure into a sequential and a causal narrative. And so that's what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with history as narrative, memory as narrative, and something that the author goes a long way towards telling a story and then deconstructing that story and saying, and yes, I had a head injury and I wasn't there, and I pieced this all together as a narrative, and I'm going to be honest about it. And without the being honest about it, that's how it almost always works.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it has to, right? Because you live life forwards, and your interpretation of the past is at least in part designed to help you understand what's going to happen in the future.
Okay, I think we are out of time.
Yes.
And thank you very much. And do remember to take the quiz and participate in the bulletin board discussion.